Navajo reservation. I became very ingrained in those communities. Some of my closest colleagues in the industry today are members of the Navajo Nation that I worked with in the mining industry. And so the operations I started at, eventually became a general manager at, in that part of the business, 90% of our workforce were Navajo tribal members from the local Navajo community. When I was the general manager there, we had 3 generations of certain families in the workforce at a time. That was not uncommon. And so it's in these tribal communities where we really sort of see the potential value and positive impact and generational socioeconomic uplift potential we have when mining is done right. And so those operations have been there a long time, and what I saw was children and grandchildren going to elite universities and gaining skilled trades because of a mining job. These are places that had 50% unemployment, household income in the $10,000 range. But we know how education is a circuit breaker for poverty. And so because of a mining job, generations of young people going and getting educations they would not have got otherwise. The other thing I saw is them never coming home to their families because there was no opportunity. And there's some really strong parallels where we're at in Santa Cruz County. The unemployment's about double the state average. The per capita income's about 40% below the state average. If you come to the U of A and get some kind of degree, it's hard to go back home if you're from there because there's not a lot of opportunity. And we are going to change that as part of what we're doing. And so these are the kinds of things that are really important. In the introduction, Craig talked about the transaction with the Navajo Nation. That was an existential business crisis where that business and our customer were both going to close in 2016 if we didn't do something completely different and restructure the business entirely. I was the president of the asset at that time, and we were trying to decide, do we let the business close or we try to do something different to sustain it? There were 1,000 Navajo families and jobs that were on the line as part of that project, and 60% of the Navajo Nation's general fund revenue came from that mine and our customer. So there was really only one opportunity we could think of to fix it, and that was to restructure the ownership in the business to move the Navajo Nation from an arm's length beneficiary to an actual equity owner. That unlocked some commercial advantages where we could sustain the business longer. But it was a pretty bold move. We had a lot of people that thought you couldn't do it. And so we embarked on a pretty bold path, and it was complicated. It required 5 or 6 approvals from the Navajo Tribal Council and President. We had to do a NEPA process, the same process that's taking 10 to 15 years for mines. We had to do one in less than 3 years or it wasn't gonna happen. Lots of other federal approvals. So we had to convince a lot of stakeholders it was the right thing to do, and we chose to use our Navajo employees to do that. It was a very invested, prideful workforce, and we got together a collection of employees that had been there a long time who really valued the business. And we took them to Window Rock, to the Navajo Nation capital, and had them talk to Navajo stakeholders. We had them meet with federal officials, and all we asked them was, just tell your story. Just talk about what working in the mine means for you and what it means for your family and what it's done for your family. We can't tell you what to say, just tell them your story. And we had one Navajo employee who I will never forget. I watched her tell her story over and over. So a Navajo woman, single mother, was supporting 3 kids by herself, and as is usually the case in tribal communities, was supporting extended family as well. And she really wanted to do this. She was very invested in the business. And I sat there and watched her tell her story over and over and over again. She talked about how proud her kids were of what she did and how that made her feel. She talked about the opportunities afforded to her kids that wouldn't be there without that job. She talked about if this closed in 2016, how she would have to move somewhere else and split the family up to even come close to having the quality of life that she has now. She would get emotional actually about it a lot. That's that moment when my personal why changed for why I work. That was a big part of it. Sitting there listening to those people tell that story over and over. And so even in projects like Hermosa, we know these projects generate lots of jobs. We throw the numbers out there. We'll employ 800 to 900 people. That's an impressive number. It's great. We all know those generate socioeconomic benefits. But what that taught me is there is a much, much deeper story about people and the positive impacts that come from what we do and how every decision we make has such a profound impact on people. And so we were successful in getting this done, and we got the final approval. We had a bit of a celebration event, and that Navajo colleague was in tears. I couldn't believe the emotion that came out. And so whenever things get tough for me in my job, and the social license work can be difficult at times, I still think of her to this day. Because employment is the most significant driver, it's the most significant source of shared value, but only if it's the potentially locally affected community that benefits from it. And I'm gonna talk in a little bit in a moment about how we think about that and what we're doing differently. That time working on the Navajo Nation taught me a lot about tribal relations as well. We have, again, a bit of a mixed past in the industry on this. I would say typically, much like what I talked about in biodiversity, we tend to engage tribes when we have to get permits. We go out and do cultural resources when it's needed for a federal permitting process. We might over-rely on government-to-government consultation that's required as part of the permitting process. So it tends to be kind of transactional. And so this is something we decided to do very differently right from the start. Many of the projects held up in permitting that aren't moving forward that have social license issues, there are tribal issues at the root of that. And we wanted to try to think about what is a different approach to that look like. And we had all learned a lot from the past. And again, what does different kind of mind look like in this sense? So 2 months after I arrived at Hermosa, we decided to just get started. So we identified 14 tribes that have historic affiliation with the Patagonia Mountains. And remember, we're 4+ years from needing to do anything on this for permitting. And so we started engaging with them, sharing our plans transparently, listening to try to understand their cultural connections to the Patagonia Mountains. What it really was what is shared value for you? Because for every stakeholder, what that means is different. And there's 14 different tribes. It's a lot of work. And so regular engagements, ongoing. We weren't doing this for permitting. It was about building relationships and understanding how we could execute the project in a way that was consistent with their expectations, understanding cultural connections and what shared value means for them. The other thing we did is we went out, similar story to biodiversity, we collected cultural resource information on an area 40 times the size of our project, 30,000 acres. Same thing as the biological information. How do we understand the cultural landscape and design a mine that will not have any impacts on prehistoric resources? And we've been able to do that by doing that work early, having it in hand. At the time we do a pre-feasibility study, we can still move things around. We moved infrastructure around to avoid impacts on prehistoric resources. And we engaged tribes transparently and got input from them on how to manage those resources, and that's what we did. Listen, and they see something happen as a result of the feedback. And so that's been very important. We're now in the formal consultation period for the federal permitting process, and it's going well, but that's not why we do it. And we're still having these informal engagements with no government officials involved at all. And so when we had the groundbreaking for our remote operating center we're building in Nogales recently, we had 6 groups of tribal leaders from 6 different tribes come and participate in that with us and celebrate the day and do blessing ceremonies before and prayers during the event. And we are finding different ways with each one of those tribes in how we work with them to do things that create shared value. So the social license piece really is about taking what we do, the products we produce, to do good for other people, and what that looks like varies by stakeholder. And so again, deliberate intent at the start to do things different. The last area I'm going to talk about is about operational technology. This is probably where you thought I was going to start. We're going to talk about automation and stuff like that. You probably thought that was the talk, but it's been a while to get there. So we had a big goal here. This is probably another area like battery electric fleets where we actually did want to be a little bit on the cutting edge. So all of our primary production processes underground will be automated or remotely operated. We won't have people on equipment. So full battery electric fleets, full autonomy or remote operations. Our process plant will be remotely operated, all from a facility that we call Centro that we're now building in Nogales. So that all sounds really cool. This is probably the part I was excited about as well, but why do we do it? What does it come back to again? People. So 2 primary objectives, one probably pretty obvious, one maybe not so obvious. Safety guarantee. 200 of our people will work at Centro, many of which would normally be underground. Obviously, there's some benefits to that. But also, it's our enabler for local workforce. Just like that Navajo example. How do we make sure that it's the local, potentially affected people that benefit from the shared value from employment? So these remote operating centers, I've been involved in a few of them in Australia. We tend, as an industry, the traditional decision is put them in a big city where it's easier to draw talent. That's the whole thought behind it. You can put them anywhere. Put it in a big city. They're in Brisbane, they're in Perth, they're in places where it's easy. So our logical decision would have been to probably put it here in Tucson. That would have been easier from an employment and workforce standpoint. But we decided to put it in Nogales because if we put it in Tucson, we wouldn't have a local workforce. The other reason it's an enabler of local workforce is with that technology and automation, we can train people who haven't worked in a mine ever with no mining experience to do those jobs in about 18 months. And so we're going to home grow our workforce over time. The way we would typically staff an operation like this is we'd probably go get a bunch of experienced miners from places that did mining like we do it, bring them here. That would create jobs, it would create economic benefits, but it wouldn't necessarily be for those that live in the community today that are potentially affected people. So we made a commitment that at least 80% of our long-term workforce will be members of the local community. And so we're having to homegrown that workforce. We've signed an MOU with the Santa Cruz Provisional College in Nogales, and we're going to train people in the community. Santa Cruz County has never had a skilled trades training program in the history of its existence. So in August, we launched the first of our training programs. We're starting to train electricians locally. That's the first skilled trades training program in the county. We've committed to train more than what we need. We're training double the electricians of what we need to provide some skills uplift and invest in long-term infrastructure. So there's a workforce development ecosystem there after we're done mining that can attract other industries and sustain the business. And so what are we going to get from that? We're going to get a very, very different workforce, and that is a very important part of being a different kind of mine. I don't probably have to tell many of you, we have a crisis in human resources and workforce in mining. One thing we have to do to solve that is get new people into mining. And so we will have a lot of people in this workforce that haven't worked in the industry. And the primary goal is to have a workforce that reflects our host community, a very diverse community. And so by design, we're going to have a very diverse workforce that brings in people that have very different life experiences, a very different background, that come from a very different place. A next generation mine needs to have a next generation culture as well, and that starts with having a next generation workforce. And so that's really important to us. That can be something that's a little bit controversial to talk about today. This is not political at all. We have to make our industry more attractive because we have a math problem. If we aren't able to source workforce from all of society, especially if we grow, we're going to struggle to staff these operations. And we think a different culture because of a different makeup of workforce is a game changer and an advantage and an essential part of next generation mining. And so that's a really important part of why putting Centro in Nogales, focusing on local workforce, committing the resources to home grow a workforce, which is not the easiest way to do it, is really important. Generation of shared value. So everything I've talked about today has a people focus to it, and I think that's an important takeaway and common thread today. One of the things I'm very thankful for is I had a lot of mentors in my time in the industry that helped me get to where I am. I shared with Gray today, many of them University of Arizona graduates. They all retired to Tucson. So, they're watching closely what we do, and I hope we honor them with our work. But it is really important that we change what we present to the people that live in the communities where we're developing these projects. I think we have to stop blaming permitting processes and start getting on with doing things differently. And you can't do that in all settings, but we've tried to be very intentional. As you've seen from this, it's a lot about the intentionality and how you approach the problem from the start, really early on. And I think importantly for the students, every decision you make, every engineering and technical decision absolutely has operational and financial implications, but every one of them has social and environmental implications as well. Gave some good examples in biodiversity, cultural resources, tailings, and emissions. And so, what are those? As you do your work, what are the social and environmental implications? How do we balance them? Who do I need to talk to understand them better? I had a good discussion with a lot of the students at lunch today, and I'm probably going to reiterate some of what we talked about because there were a lot of great questions. I felt like I did half the presentation at lunch, but you know, I think what's really important is learn as much as you can about the industry and expand your horizons. If I hadn't done some things that were a little bit uncomfortable career path wise, I would have really struggled, as I said, to lead and be the best leader I could be in this operation, in this project. I think be bold, do things where you have the opportunity to push boundaries and do things differently. We have a long ways to go, I think, before society still appreciates, understands, and supports what we do. But there's a huge opportunity with where we are today to do things differently. And so I don't think there's ever been a more exciting time to be in our industry. I'm envious of you. I wish I was starting today. It's incredible, you know, it's about the only thing when we go to Washington we see bipartisan support for is the need to reduce the security risk around these supply chains. And so as I was preparing for this lecture, I did some reflection that I really hadn't ever done before. I was just thinking about where I started and where we are now, and you don't get the chance to do that very often. But a couple things came to me. One is, I think all of the students and early career professionals that are coming in the industry now, there's no doubt you're far more aware of the social and environmental implications of what we do than I ever could have been when I came out. There's obviously no doubt you're more comfortable with technology and how we can use innovation and technology to do things differently. And I think you will do amazing things with that. But the reflection for that for me is think about it, if Hermosa or next generation mining or these things we're talking about today are your starting point. I could have never imagined if you'd shown Hermosa to me or if you talked about engineering to reduce impacts on cultural resources or biodiversity, or that we could do some of the things technologically to bring people into the industry. I couldn't have imagined it. And so think about that next generation of change for you. If this is your starting point, the opportunities to do things different, the possibilities. And I think the lesson in that for me is I wish I had unconstrained my thinking a little earlier in my career. How do you make sure you don't constrain your thinking too much and challenge what we do? Because if I had known what was possible back then, I probably would have pushed a little harder at times on things. And I think that'll be important. So when we finish mining at Hermosa, these are finite resources. At some point it'll end. Hopefully it's a long time from now, but it'll end. But if we've done things right, we won't be talking about ghost towns anymore. We will have made the right kinds of investments, partnerships, and collaborations where there's a community that comes out of mining, a history of mining thriving, that's developed new opportunities, new economies, generational educational opportunities for people, infrastructure to support all that, and the quality of life's gone to a new level. That's the legacy I want to be a part of. That's what gets me out of bed every day. That was that big shift for me in my career, and it's why I'm so proud to be working with the team that we have to try to develop something different, that presents something different to our stakeholders, that moves us closer to acceptance, social license, and realization of how we can do things different in the industry. And so I really am, again, honored and humbled to have been here with you today and be able to share this story. And thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have.